So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcella Paris, and as the director of the Lewiston Public Library, I would like to welcome you all to the Great Falls Forum. The Forum is a monthly speaker series featuring leaders in the areas of business, public policy, academia, and the arts, and is a partnership of Bates College, the Sun Journal, and the Lewiston Public Library. Today is the final Great Falls Forum of this year, the 23rd season of the program. And so I want to thank everyone who continued to join us virtually, as well as the almost 300 viewers who reported that this was their first time attending on Zoom. We hope that you'll continue to join us in September for the start of the 24th season. A recording of today's program, as always, will be available starting tomorrow on the library's YouTube page or later this afternoon on Facebook. Please visit lplonline.org for more information. And a little housekeeping for today's program. Those on Zoom will see a Q&A option at the bottom of the screen. Please use this to enter any questions for our speaker today. And for those joining us on Facebook Live, go ahead and type your questions in the comment box there, and we'll make sure that our speaker receives them. Today, I have the pleasure to introduce our featured speaker, Cynthia McFadden. Cynthia is a senior legal and investigative correspondent for NBC News, reporting on human rights abuses, national security, and a wide range of other issues. Over the years, her work has been recognized with journalism's most coveted awards, including multiple Emmys, the Overseas Press Awards, and the Edward R. Murrow Award, among numerous others. Before joining NBC in 2014, Cynthia worked for 20 years at ABC News, where she co-anchored Primetime and later Nightline, along with serving as the network's legal correspondent. She is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Bowdoin College and also of the Columbia University Law School, and has covered a vast array of legal issues, often focusing on humanitarian issues, specifically the abuses suffered by women and children all over the world. Known for her interviewing skills, she has profiled policymakers and presidents, celebrities and criminals, and she's not saying which are more difficult. So without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome home Cynthia McFadden.
That's true. I won't make it more difficult. Marcella, thank you so much for that introduction. It's great to be here. I'm at home in Maine, and I assume one of the few good things about being remote is that footwear is not an issue. Thank goodness. High heels I have banned from my house, and I hope that we can have some solidarity on that. So greetings, Maine friends. I really do love Maine and miss so much of what she has to offer. And I don't just mean lobster. I grew up in Auburn, ELHS forevermore, went down the road to Bowdoin for college. And then after saving a little money from working from the Sisters of Charity, just down the road from you at the St. Mary's Hospital, I headed off for law school at Columbia in my U-Haul van. There were many adventures along the way. I graduated from Columbia, but went with the intention of becoming a journalist, which I'm happy to say I have practiced that craft for the last 40 years. I mention all of this because when I was a kid, my world was the Twin Cities. In fact, I was really kind of confused. When Walter Cronkite talked about LA, I thought he meant Lewiston-Auburn. Clearly, I had a lot to learn. So hello, it is really nice to be home, if only virtually. And I really want to thank Marcella and the Lewiston Public Library and Bates and the Sun Journal for asking me to chat with you today. I didn't tell Marcella this, but as a kid, one of my summer jobs was working at the arch rival, the Auburn Public Library. I must confess, I nearly brought the whole place to its knees. How, you may ask? I've always been a horrible speller. I still am. But I am enthusiastic. And when Mrs. Cody asked me one day to address about 100 absentee, overdue notices on postcards, that was back in the day, I dutifully did them, put about half of them in the mail before she looked at what I had done. And in very perfect lettering, the return address I had written was the Auburn Public Library. An unintentional mistake. They survived and so did I. Anyway, so here I am. As a student at Edward Little, I was worked for the Sun Journal as the editor of the school page. I don't know if you guys still do that, but it was really a great experience and one of my first experiences in journalism. They pay better at NBC, I'll say that. Anyway, much of my attitude about life, about work, about what is meaningful was forged not just by Maine, but by my two wonderful Maine parents, Arlene and Warren McFadden. They were pretty strict, and we were not rich in things, but they gave me two things that are more valuable than anything: unwavering love and unflinching support. And, they supported me even when they weren't sure why I was doing it, or maybe that it was such a hot idea. One of those key things was moving to New York. They thought I was nuts. And I must say there were periods of which I thought I was too. But they supported me nonetheless. And that support meant everything. I'm going to tell you, if you'll permit me, 3 short stories about my parents, which I think helps explain a lot about me and my view of the world. Then I'll tell you a little bit about some of the stories I've been working on most recently, and then we'll open up to a dialogue. I hope you'll have some questions. As they say on Reddit, ask me anything. That doesn't mean I'll necessarily answer, but I'll give it a go. So back to my parents. For reasons that I do not know, by people who I do not know, I was put up for adoption when I was a baby. That was at what was then the Central Maine General Hospital. And my mother had had several miscarriages at that point. And her doctor, I love these names, Dr. Twaddle, suggested that she and my father might want to consider adoption. So he said that 3 of his patients would be having babies in the spring and to come down on a given night to the nursery after hours. So they did. In early June, they went down to the nursery and there were 3 little girl babies all wrapped up, 2 of them behaving very nicely. I, however, was screaming at the top of my lungs. And the nurse picked me up and handed me to Arlene McFadden, and I stopped crying. And she said to my dad, "I think this is our baby." And he said, "Yes." And they brought me home, and that was that. I was really lucky from the start. I also had gotten a big reward for speaking out, and I think that always provided a little encouragement in my, let's just say, my willingness to ask hard questions and to raise my voice, which I do from time to time. My second story about my parents was about paying for Bowdoin. My dad worked for the phone company for, golly, 50 years. I honestly don't know how much money he made, but I doubt it was ever over $40,000 or $50,000 a year. And although I had won a full scholarship to Bates, I won the state debate championship when I was a junior. Maybe it was a half scholarship, but it was a lot of money. With regret, Bates, great school, I wanted to go to Bowdoin. And my parents said, "Okay, that's your dream. We'll support that." And when I applied early decision and was admitted, I said, "Daddy, they sent me these papers. We can apply for financial aid." And my father said, "No, that should be for the people who need it. Your mother and I have saved enough money to send you, and we want to send you. That is our lifelong gift to you, an education." So they did. Neither of my parents had the chance to go to college. In fact, no one in my immediate family had. So the third story is about the day I graduated from law school at Columbia. Standing in front of that beautiful Low library, my father looked at me and said the following, which is this: just remember, with all this education, it's your responsibility to now go and find work that is meaningful to you. Anybody, Cindy, can have a job they don't like. Well, and that simple wisdom, it's really served me well. And I am proud to say that the law school has asked me to give the commencement address a couple of times since then, and both times I featured that wise advice from my wonderful father, who parenthetically had served in World War II and had been a prisoner of war in Germany during the war. He certainly gave to this country and gave to me as well. So I miss them dearly. I grew up on Monroe Street at first, and then we moved to Cleveland Avenue in Auburn. So a little bit about the work that I've been doing. I will break this into a couple of areas. Let me talk first about some of the work during the pandemic, which we have all lived through and are still all living through, some of the work I did around that, and then talk about some of the international work that I've done. I know I titled this From Maine to Madagascar, so we will get to Madagascar, where I went a couple of years ago. First, the pandemic. Many of my colleagues were doing extremely good work on the front lines of reporting about the infection rates and the development of the vaccines and all of that. So I carved a relatively different path. I began by looking at healthcare workers and the challenges that they were experiencing. One of our first pieces way back in March was talking to visiting nurses who were going to be coming from all over the country to help New York out as New York suffered through that first wave. And it was so moving, their reasons for coming, their devotion. Later on, we put together a panel of doctors who had come from across the country to understand better their experience. And we began to understand that at the beginning, part of the challenge was that the doctors really didn't understand what they were seeing and how it was manifesting because the symptoms were so wide-ranging. But one of the doctors explained, this was probably 4 or 5 months in, that they had discovered in the intensive care units that proning, that is turning patients over, so simple, was so effective in helping them recover. And other medications that came along as well. You know about remdesivir and others. It was very interesting to see the pandemic from that bird's eye view. We did the first interview with the medical head of Bellevue about how they were preparing and what they were doing. I did the first interview with the head of Sloan Kettering, the world-renowned cancer hospital. Imagine having cancer and going through COVID. That was very moving. In fact, the people there were so worried that the nation had really stopped screening for cancer, which is largely true, that we would be seeing in the coming 6 months, the coming year, a huge uptick in the number of people with cancer because those screenings had fallen by the wayside for understandable reasons. So that was very rewarding work. I was also really interested in the unintended consequences of what was happening. As students started to attend school remotely, we quickly saw that there was a huge digital divide in America. And I have a producer who I love working with named Jake Whitman, who lives in Detroit. So we decided to double down. I remotely from here at home in Connecticut and Jake in Detroit, and tell the tale of two neighborhoods just a mile apart. And how one neighborhood, the kids were doing great, and the other neighborhood, not so much, in part as a result of the digital divide. One group of kids were, anybody who didn't have a computer was given one on the first day at home. Other kids were struggling, trying to do it on their phones. Many didn't have broadband services. All of this we know so well now, but at the time, this was very early on. And I hope it opened some eyes to the challenges. And I'm proud to say I work for a company, Comcast, really stepped in many of their service areas and provided free or low-cost broadband to a huge swath of the country. And I'm proud to say we did a couple of stories focused on a couple of schools over the course of time where they stepped up in a big way, and that was gratifying. We also looked at inequality with a different lens. I had been interested in doing some work around Native Americans prior to the pandemic. I'm a big admirer of Tom Brokaw. I came to NBC after he had left the anchor chair, but was still around. I'd known him for years. And one day he sent me a note several years ago and said, Cynthia, I'm begging you to dig down into the questions surrounding our treatment of Native Americans. And so we had started doing the work. We hadn't put it on television yet, but when the pandemic struck, we decided to try to take a really intense look at how things were playing out on Navajo Nation, which, as you may know, is part of 4 states in the corner out west. And the pandemic had struck very hard. The rate of infection at the beginning was higher than any other place in the country. Not the gross numbers, of course, because it's a much smaller population, but the rate of infection was sky high. We partnered with the Johns Hopkins Center, which provides health services there on that reservation, to try to get a deeper look, and did so. We broadcast our first report from Navajo Nation. Again, I was remote in April, right after things had locked down. So this is a little bit of a transition, but I think you'll see why I'm telling you. In July, my son, who was home from college, he goes to USC out in Los Angeles, had come home for spring break, and of course hadn't gone back. School had not reopened, but we had to close his apartment. So we decided to drive across the country. Now, Spencer, being a good New York City boy, having grown up in New York, did not have a driver's license. He did have a permit, but he was not a big fan of driving, wasn't very good at it, and was more than happy to say he never intended to get a license. But I said, if we're going to drive to California, you've got to do half of it. And he agreed. And I also had another stipulation that on the way home, we would stop at Navajo Nation and do some reporting. So we did that too. And it was an incredibly meaningful experience for both of us. NBC deputized him as a production assistant. So it was Spencer and me and our cameraman, Ray Farmer, who spent, I guess, 4 days on Navajo Nation. We produced 5 stories as a result over the course of the next several weeks. And they brought a lot of a new perspective, I hope, to some of the issues that were happening there. It was a deeply gratifying experience for all of us. We talked to the president of Navajo Nation about the challenges, and we talked the challenges that existed before COVID and that had been exposed by COVID. I mean, it was crazy, the regulations that inhibited their ability to really mobilize. And yet, Navajo Nation was able to do something relatively early on that much of the country had been unable to do. And that is, through very stringent public health requirements, they had really sheltered in place. They had really enforced overnight curfews, and they had stopped the curve on Navajo Nation, which was super impressive. I think it was a combination of these very intense health guidelines, as well as a real sense of community, a caring for one another. So that was interesting. My first trip, I mean, I was a girl who grew up, I'd never been on an airplane until I was, I don't know, probably 21. And I like to joke that I've never been off an airplane since then. But for the last year and a half, had not been traveling. So my first trip in, I guess, maybe 15, 16 months was a trip to Uganda. I had been fully vaccinated, which was required to go on this trip. UNICEF had given us the exclusive to go and see for ourselves the beginning of the rollout of the COVAX vaccines, which I know you've heard about, the World Health Organization and others having banded together to provide vaccine to the 100 poorest countries in the world. So Uganda was one of them. We picked Uganda in part because they would allow us in, and because there wasn't a quarantine period. Many of the other countries, it was just too cumbersome to get in and get out. But Uganda allowed us to come, and we had an incredible experience. And I would be happy to answer questions later about the details of that. But suffice it to say the following. Only 1% of the population could be vaccinated with the vaccine that arrived. 1%. It all went to healthcare workers. All the healthcare workers were not covered, but it was a start. And we got to see the difficulty of getting those vaccines around the country. The infrastructure is scattered, fractured. It took us from the capital, from Kigali, from Entebbe, I guess the vaccine was in Entebbe, to the Buvuma Islands, which are in the middle of Lake Victoria. It was multiple cars and multiple boats. And I'll tell you, to see the joy on the people's faces as we arrived in that last mile in the boat was really exciting. But since we've returned, we're told that no more vaccine has been taken to the Buvuma Islands because they don't have enough money to buy the gas to power the boats. One of the things that had not been accounted for in the distribution, the rollout of the vaccines around the world, is the cost of distribution. Now, you may well say, well, listen, I'm vaccinated, or I'm not worried about it. I mean, my neighborhood's good, my family's good. So, good luck to the people, the rest of the world. But what epidemiologists have told us repeatedly, and this is one of them being a man named Larry Brilliant, Dr. Brilliant, who was credited with playing a major role in the elimination of smallpox a couple of decades ago. And until the world is vaccinated, no one is truly safe because the virus doesn't understand about borders and the variants will continue to develop, which is why, in addition to humanitarian concerns, which is why we should all be concerned about the vaccine being available. One doctor told me, again, highly regarded epidemiologist, that unless the world becomes more vaccinated, we can pick the percentage, but we're at a very low level right now in the rest of the world. This could extend the life of this pandemic, get ready, another 7 years. So none of us want that. We can talk about that more if you'd like in the chat. Finally, let me tell you a little bit more about my other international travels. A couple of, so much of the work that I get to do, and I must say, moving from ABC to NBC was a big move. I was late in my career to do it. But NBC offered this incredible opportunity. They said, essentially, we'll let you go where you want and tell the stories you think are most important. Well, I guess I believe I have the best job in journalism. They've been true to that. I've worked there now 7 years. Having worked 20 at ABC. And so, I try to avoid the sort of rip and tear stories where you read it in the newspaper and you go out and try to replicate it on television. Those are not as gratifying. So most of my reporting these days starts from a question. And I ask the question to my team of producers, where is the worst place in the world to be a child? Now, there were way too many contenders for that ignominious distinction. But the answer came back, at least that year, from the United Nations and their reporting on such things, that the Central African Republic was the worst place in the world to be a child. Part of that was because of the decade-long civil war, which was still raging, tremendous hunger and insecurity, fleeing refugees with no place to go. And so the internal security situation there, highly fraught. No Western journalists had been in to cover the situation for 5 years, in part because of that, and because journalists had been targeted by the rebels. In fact, just before we went, a team of 3 Russian journalists had been murdered. So you make a calculated risk. NBC insisted on our bringing security with us, which usually when we do that, it means that we have someone who used to be special forces somewhere who comes with us on the journey. We did have flak jackets, bulletproof vests that we wore on occasion. And we did have to change our itinerary quite frequently because of security concerns. But we were able to see some stunning things and bring back a really powerful story about what was facing the children and the people there. And, I'm so proud to say that when we came back with the story, the Today Show and our bosses said, is there a call to action here? Is there something that our viewers can do to help? And I have to say, I think that people thought, well, holy goodness, most people probably have never even heard of the Central African Republic, much less want to support it. But at the end of the story, I said, if you want to know more, if you want to help, go to our website and you can. And what we'd seen in practice there were these little bars called plumpy nut. Now, those of you who have taken a look at international hunger efforts will know that plumpy nut was developed as a full-on nutritional supplement for children, and one a day is enough to keep a child going for another day. They're sort of like power bars, only they have a full day's nutrition in them. In the old days, there used to be these kinds of supplements, but they required that you had to mix them with water. Well, finding clean water in some of these circumstances is very difficult, and it also was cumbersome. So plumpy nuts really changed everything. And so we said, plumpy nuts can be bought for less than $1 a bar. 10, I can't remember specifically, but I think it was, a $10 donation can keep 10 kids going for another 10 days with plumpy nuts. And do you know that within 24 hours, the American people had given $1 million to help those kids? I mean, not in big donations, in $5 and $10 and $20 contributions. And within a week, I think the number was almost $2 million. So that felt pretty good. Another area that, well, we're okay. So that was the Central African Republic. I also had the chance to go to Bangladesh just before COVID shut things down. We were there in late February. So here's the question that brought us there. Have you ever thought about this? With millions of children now growing up in refugee camps, most camps have little or no education. Some do, many don't. And many children will grow up there. What about early childhood education? What can be done? What is being done? Well, I'm happy to tell you that Sesame Street, in the course of the last couple of years, had been given $200 million grants from foundations. That's right, 100. So that's $200 million to develop early childhood education for the Syrian camps, for the Rohingya camps and others, a protocol for how to help kids in the way that Sesame has uniquely been able to do for American children and other children around the world. So we took an incredible trip with the Cookie Monster, and we went to the Rohingya camps. Now, the Rohingya are a stateless people. They don't have, now don't panic. That is just NBC's camera. And NBC has this weird glitch in their camera. This means I've been talking for 20 minutes because it turns off maybe a little bit more. It turns off about every 20 minutes on its own, and then it comes back. And I have to stand up. Here, I'm coming back now. I have to go and turn it back on. Why it does this, no one's really been able to answer, but it does. So I hope you didn't. I meant to tell you that at the beginning that was going to happen, but it did, and here we still are. Okay, so anyway, so the Cookie Monster met up with us along with Sherry Weston, who's an old friend of mine. Her husband, David Weston, was at one point the president of ABC. She now runs the international outreach for Sesame Street, and we had an extraordinary trip. As I was saying, the Rohingyas are a stateless people. They have no birth certificates. They have no passports. They are stuck in this spot in Bangladesh. The circumstances are very, very, very challenging. And it's the largest refugee camp now in the world, well over 1 million people. There's no running water, there's no sanitation, there are no schools. So what Sesame has brought is so welcome. And we got to see some of the play labs that are being developed and some of the other resources that Sesame is bringing there. And my colleague at CBS, Leslie Stahl, and my friend Leslie Stahl had gone to Syria and done a similar story about Sesame's work there, which was on 60 Minutes. Perhaps you saw it. Also so interesting. So we had the chance to do that. And finally, Madagascar. There is a booming business in exploiting children in the supply chain. Millions of children around the world still work uncompensated, are forced to work. And, you know, these are complicated issues. But we were interested in looking at an industry that had not been explored previously, to see whether there was a supply chain that could be better understood, and where accountability could be had. So incredibly talented young producer came up with something that, must say, I was really unaware of. Perhaps you know that mica is in just about every electronic device you can imagine. It is a form of insulation so that electronics don't overheat. You know how sometimes your cell phone gets like too hot to handle? Well, bad mica. Sheet mica, not the little sort of, you know, you probably saw mica as a kid, right? And rocks, the little shiny stuff. Well, sheet mica is great big pieces of mica. And Madagascar is the largest producer, second largest producer of sheet mica in the world. And so we went to find out what the circumstances of that mining was. And what we found was shocking, beyond shocking. Little tiny children as young as 2 and 3 employed. And when I say employed, I mean working, being lowered into caves to pick out this mica, chop it out, and then to separate it with, as one of the owners of one of these big companies said, yes, those little fingers are so good for separating the mica. Well, anyhow, many, many international corporations are dependent upon this flow of mica from Madagascar. And most of the mica in Madagascar goes to China, where it's then processed and distributed. So the supply chain is fuzzy at best, but we were able to track down several companies that were using mica from the mines where we had been. And, you know, the reaction of many companies, oh, I didn't know. And so my follow-on question is, well, you do now. And so now what? Is it okay with you to have part of your supply chain be dependent upon the most vulnerable children in the world? So anywho, we went to Congress and asked them about it. And there are laws banning the import of products that depend upon child labor. And so mica from Madagascar was added to that list last year. And happily, many manufacturers want to work with those who are knowledgeable about this area to clean up their supply chains. When you see the pictures that we brought back, no thinking person, no feeling person would want their success to be dependent upon the suffering of these children, and largely their mothers. So, you know, most corporations have said, you know, help us do better, not to us, but to those who specialize in such things. And there has been a movement since we broadcast the story to do that. And I am very proud to say that we did win the Emmy for that last year. And, you know, you don't do this stuff for the prizes, but the prizes help encourage your bosses to say, let's keep doing it. So I'm going to keep doing it. Anyway, I've now talked for quite some time and would encourage you, if you have any questions, to ask them. As I say, Marcella is going to come in and help me with this. Marcella, are you there somewhere? It's so weird to just talk and talk and talk. It's my favorite thing, but hi, Marcella.
Hello, thank you. So we do have a couple things that come in here, but I encourage others to continue adding questions to the Q&A or on Facebook if you're there. So we had a comment from Kathy saying that you were a couple of years behind me, I presume at EL. She says, I love to watch you. We have another question that's come in here. Cynthia, the media has changed in different ways in your 40 years. People get news in many ways. Where do you see the news media in 10 years?
Boy, I wish my crystal ball was a little clearer, but you're sure right. It has changed enormously. I mean, imagine when I was a kid, we had 3 networks, right? And then sort of the upstart of PBS, but it was NBC, CBS, ABC. And now it's so diffuse. And in some ways, that just means there are more voices, and that's a good thing. In other ways, I think, the internet does not have an editor. And so you can say pretty much anything you want. I encourage people to rely on vetted news sources. Sometimes it's hard to know what's legitimate and what's not. There are a couple of new operations, though, that and I'm not going to get their names right. There are a couple of new websites which have hired very interesting, knowledgeable people to assess the validity of the reporting on particular sites. And I think maybe that helps. But where do I see it going? I'm not telling any secrets to say that the audience for traditional network news has declined over the last many years. And, but the interest in and the need for stories and information isn't going anywhere. We're just going to get it in a different way. I mean, we always are going to need to know, both on a local level, what's happening, and on a national and international level. Back in the days where print was king, when radio came in, print journalists were like, this is going to be the end of us. Well, it took a lot longer than that. But print, suffering the same challenges. How do you continue to keep local newspapers vibrant? So many have died in the last decade or so, and so many others are teetering. How do we continue to make local newspapers vibrant? I mean, they are in so many ways still the lifeblood of the community. How do we continue to make local television stations vibrant and able to report? I think there are real challenges. I mean, various news organizations are looking at various ways to try to pay for, supplement what you can get online. There were paywalls, as you all know. And, I tell you, I come up against the paywalls and even I'm going like, but I realize that they're there for a good reason. Somebody has to pay for the journalism that backs up that site. So a long answer to a really good question, and I'm flopping around because I don't really have a very good answer, except to say that I do think, and I think that my colleagues in network news think that the future is really going to be digital. It's going to be streaming, and we are at NBC exploring all kinds of options for that. Traditional appointment television. Sitting down at 6:30 every night and watching the evening news as my parents did every night of their lives. That's not how people's lives are structured anymore. So it's going to change. I hope the quality can be maintained as those changes occur. Thanks for the question.
So we have another one here. In all of your travels, do you have a favorite country or two that particularly stands out as a place to visit?
Oy. Do I have a favorite? Listen, I mean, this is a really cheesy answer, really, but I mean, oh, what I wouldn't give to go to Italy right now. I have done some reporting from Italy, but that's been more of a holiday site. I do love it, and I also love Thailand. I've been to the Far East a few times, and Thailand is a wonderful place to visit. I highly recommend. You know, you have to keep your eye out in visiting some places now because of COVID, but also just security. You don't keep an eye out, but yeah, I do love it. And there are many places in Africa that I could return to over and over again. You know, I've often said that I've covered a lot of very painful stories in Africa, and yet I'm always prepared for the pain, but never for the joy. And there is a resilience and there's something about it that appeals to me. Maybe it's this sort of resilience and strong family ties. And I mean, maybe it reminds me of home in a funny kind of way. There is a real sense of community. And yeah, I've had wonderful experiences in Kenya and some painful ones as well, covering famine. Tanzania. Gosh, I mean, I've been all over the continent. So yes, I would say if there are a few places in Africa I would urge you put on the bucket list. An African safari, nothing like it. I promised my son, who is an animal nut when he was a little boy, that it you know, all things being equal, I would take him on safari when he was 13. And I'm happy to say I was able to do that. We had the most magical time. So those were a few.
So one attendee is asking, how did a girl from Maine know about careers like you trained for?
You know what? That's the joke of it all. I didn't know anything. And I mean, the reason I went to law school was because I didn't know how to become a journalist. And I'll tell you a funny story. This was back in the day before email. So I applied to Columbia and I wrote my essay to the law school about how I wanted to be a journalist. And the admissions dean of the law school, we didn't have cell phones either. My phone at home rang, and it was the dean of the admissions. And he said, look, Cynthia, we're inclined to admit you, but we feel honor bound to tell you there are much easier ways to become a journalist than coming to Columbia Law School. And I said, well, I don't know any of them. So if you'll have me, I'm coming. And the truth is, I kind of thought I might like to cover the law or politics, and that I thought it would be a good training. And at Bowdoin, some of you may remember do you remember the Maine paper? It was done by a guy named John Cole, and he was an adjunct professor. And he had said to me, I said, you know, I really want to be a journalist. And he had said, you know, I think specialization is the future. So I wouldn't advise you to go to journalism school. I would advise you to study something, whatever you're passionate about, if it's economics, if it's science, whatever. And that would be a good way to become a journalist. So it served me well. I mean, it allowed me to enter the profession. You know, remember now, when I was doing this, it was still maybe, and it still is, but it was then a significant challenge to be a young woman. And the professional degree really made a difference and helped me be taken, I think, more seriously than I might have been otherwise. So I'm glad I got the law degree. While I was at Columbia, I also took classes in the journalism school, which is how I met Fred Friendly, who became my mentor and my friend and my employer. He had been the president of CBS. He was then teaching at the journalism school, but he had a program on public television, which some of you may have seen over the years. We did these big roundtables with professors peppering people with a hypothetical case study. We did one on the Constitution, on terrorism, on the news media, and I became his executive producer. I always joke and say I became the executive producer, which was a joke. He was the executive producer, but he gave me the title because he didn't really have any money. So we thought maybe I'd switch. And so, yes, I did it. Anyway, why I wanted to be a journalist, I can remember I grew up during Watergate, and I can remember lying on the living room floor on Cleveland Avenue in Auburn, Maine, and thinking, I want to be there. I want to be there. I want to be in that front row. I want to be asking the hard questions. I want to be, trite but true, having a seat in the front row of history. And so, and nobody told me I couldn't. My parents said, that's what you want to do it.
So we have another question here from someone who says they were a few years ahead of you at Edward Little and have lived since then on Cleveland Avenue.
It's a good place to live, isn't it? Yeah. How far up? Where were you on Cleveland Avenue? I guess you
know. Let's see if they chime in. So she also asks, how do you manage to get to the deepest heart of reporting and maintain the ability to let it go?
Boy, that is the ultimate question, isn't it? If you don't let yourself feel, you're not doing your job. And if you feel too much, you can't do your job. And there are other professions like this, medicine is one. And I find that, I find that I have to keep my heart really open when I'm going into places where there is a lot of pain. But I also have to figure out a way to make enough distance to be able to report it. And, I don't always get it right. My meter can teeter on either side. Barbara Walters became both mentor and friend to me. And I always used to joke with her and say that she made other people cry and the people I interview make me cry. So I guess she did better with it than I did. But yeah, we've had to stop the camera more than a few times, not because the subject is crying, but because I am. Yeah. I don't know how to do this and not feel it. I'm not there when the school bus arrives safely. When the school bus arrives safely, that's not when they call me. It's when there's an utter disaster that I go. And that's the nature of the business. Now, I do get to do happy stories sometimes and uplifting ones sometimes, but for the most part, this big, powerful headlamp that I get to wear, I get to look in the dark corners. And that often, there's often a lot of pain in those corners.
Another question, any advice for inspiring journalists in our community today?
Yeah, right. Take your iPhone and go out and tell stories. Hold the camera sideways. That's the broadcast length. If you do this way, that's, when people shoot video this way, that's when you get those, they put those bars up on the screen, the background thing. If you hold the camera this way, it fills the full screen on the television. Tell stories, interview everyone you meet. Curiosity is what it takes to be a journalist. Lyle Denniston, who is the great Supreme Court reporter from the Baltimore Sun, used to say this: a journalist is just a little kid who wants to be the first one down the street in the morning saying, guess what I know? So if you have that in you, if you want to tell stories, if you're curious about the world and other people, then by all means, it's a wonderful profession. You get to talk to really interesting people. You get to go to really interesting places, and you get to learn a lot about the world and about yourself. So I encourage anybody who wants to be a journalist, don't let anyone tell you, that the job market's hard. Anything worth it is worth going for. Everything's hard. Everything worth it is hard, but there are jobs, and you don't have to wait until someone anoints you. Be a journalist. Be a journalist in your own world right now. Tell the stories, and we now have the equipment to do it. I have shot plenty. I have 2 iPhones sitting here. I have shot many chunks of stories that I have been reporting on my iPhone that have ultimately made it into the piece, and you couldn't tell the difference. Now, why? Because the camera's someplace else at the moment something happens, and I grab the thing and put it sideways and and hit record. So, you've got what it takes. Go do it.
see, we've got another one here. What was your major at Bowdoin? Since you've answered the question about why you went to law school rather than journalism school, shout out to John Cole and all the wonderful journalists at Maine Times. And did you take the bar?
Okay, well, that's a lot of questions. I majored in government and legal studies and sociology at Bowdoin. I had a double major. When I went to Bowdoin, I was in the third class of, maybe it's the fourth. I think it was the third class of women to go all the way through, and the fourth class of women to graduate at all at Bowdoin. So Bowdoin was still very much a male institution, which was bringing women into the college. At first, there was a quota on the number of women. So I was really proud to be among the group that started off. I'll tell you a funny story. And when I was a little girl, I went to the High Street Congregational Church on High Street in Auburn. And Don Weber, Judge Weber, who was on the Maine State Supreme Court, also attended the church. And I just looked up to him extravagantly. And he was on the governing boards at Bowdoin. And I'm not sure that he was entirely in favor of women going to Bowdoin. And he said to me one day after church, well, we're going to vote to let women go to Bowdoin. And I'm not sure it's a good idea, but if women are going to go to Bowdoin, then I think you should be one of them. And so with his encouragement, I'm happy to say I did become one of them. So that was that. But what I was going to say about my major, there were only 2 tenured women on the faculty at Bowdoin at that time. And one of them was head of the sociology department, and her name was Matilda White Riley. And she became a very important person in my life. She was an expert. Her area of expertise was in aging. And she had worked for the National Institute on Aging, and she had published extensively about it. And really, when I was studying with her, I had a momentary thought about becoming an academic and continuing with some of her work. Her real area of expertise was in intergenerational studies and how cohorts affected one another as they moved through the life course. Okay, all right, this is getting way too techy. But anyway, it was just really interesting to me. And I am not admitted to the bar, which is a good thing because I've probably broken an awful lot of rules. So I never practiced, no. I did work at a law firm in the summer, a couple of summers, because the pay was so fantastic. You could almost pay for the next semester. I worked at Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, and McCloy, which was a very fancy Wall Street law firm, white shoe law firm, as I used to call them, down on Wall Street. It was the Chase Manhattan Bank lawyer, and it was in the Trust and Estates Department, represented Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. So it was really interesting, massive law firm. And I would have been a lousy lawyer, let me tell you. Not my thing. I like understanding how lawyers think, but I wouldn't say I'm very, remember, I'm a horrible speller, and I'm not very patient, and I'm not very good on details. So no, the legal profession lost nothing when I did not practice. All right, we'd have time for a few more.
I think so.
4 minutes? Okay, 4 minutes. I'll try to be briefer, sorry.
So what are you working on now? And how do you go about choosing the next story?
Listen, I'm open to suggestions. I'm about to take a pause. I don't know if you guys watched yesterday. I had a story on the Today Show and on Nightly News about the terrible plight of increasing number of children with mental health challenges in America and how few resources we have to deal with it. We had gained access to a hospital in Columbus, the Nationwide Children's, which has just in the last year opened a $160 million pavilion specializing in behavioral health for children and adolescents. And, you know, places around the country are saying they can't afford to do it, closing resources because insurance does not reimburse mental health care in the same way that it does other care. And it's a real challenge. What we learned in Columbus was that they do a sort of Robin Hood funding, where they take from services within the hospital that do make money and they put those resources into behavioral health care, which doesn't make money. So that, with a lot of local support, has allowed them to open this facility. It's really state of the art. It's beautiful. And the work that goes on inside is beautiful too. So just to give you a couple of stats, perhaps you're aware that 1 out of 5 children in America today have diagnosable mental health challenges, most of which will never be treated. That the second leading cause of death among children between the ages of 10 and 17 is death by suicide. That mental health challenges present 50% of them by 14. Again, most of those children will never get any kind of help. So and during the pandemic, things only got worse. The proportion of children presenting in emergency rooms went up 31% for kids 12 to 17. And get this, up a really shocking 24% for kids between the ages of 5 and 11. You know, there's something going on in this country, and we have to get a grip on it and make sure we provide services to these kids. Boy, all right, we have 1 minute left. I can do a minute question. Give it to me.
Would you advise that reporters and journalists learn other languages?
Oh man, it's such a failing that I don't speak another language. I took French and enough to read a menu, but seriously, it is my education is sorely lacking by not being fluent in another language. I wish I could speak Spanish. So much of my work would be improved by it, but I would take anything. I would be thrilled to speak Portuguese. I know you speak that. Marcella, I would love to speak anything. It would really make a difference. And it's shameful that I graduated from Bowdoin College without being able to speak a language. Bowdoin didn't have distribution requirements back in the day. And while I loved it as an undergraduate, I now am very sad about that. I'm happy my son is fluent in Spanish. I mean, it's so important and it's so expanding, and it's you know, boy, I wish I could do that over again. I've tried that Duolingo course and I'm really bad at it, but maybe if I keep practicing, I can get it. Anyway, thank you guys. It was really nice to be home, if only metaphorically. And I plan to come up and see my cousins this summer in Maine, and there's no place like Maine.
I just want to thank you very much. This was a delight. And we couldn't get to all the questions that are here, but a huge swath of them are really just expressing how proud everyone is that, you know, a hometown Maine girl went and made it big and is out there representing Maine in a fantastic and reputable way. And so I just want to make sure that you hear that from everyone in the comments here. There's at least 6 more saying as much.
You know, story ideas, send them to Marcella. She can be my main agent here, okay? Will you do that? Would you do that if they have stories?
Happy to.
Okay, I'd love that. I mean, because you know what? The best stories come from the people who are living them. So send them along. I mean, I would love to come and talk about diversity in Lewiston and the challenges and benefits of that. I think that's a great story for the future. I always try to find things to bring me home. So
we would love to have you back.
Yeah, all right. Well, all right. You're now anointed.
Excellent. Thank you again, Cynthia. And thank you to everyone who joined us today.
Thanks, everybody. Great to see you.